Have you ever wondered what really happens the moment you stop playing along with the illusion everyone else depends on? That single shift in awareness, that piercing flash of spiritual clarity, can feel like stepping out of a warm room into a cold, merciless truth. When the layers of conditioning and social performance begin to fall away, you suddenly see the hidden structures, the emotional masks, the unconscious agreements that keep people comfortable. And once you see them, you cannot return to blindness. This is the unsettling beginning of the spiritual awakening process, the moment when elevated perception collides with the fragile psychology of the crowd. Breaking the collective illusion forces you to confront how much of human interaction is built on avoidance rather than authenticity. You start noticing the forced laughter, the recycled narratives, the quiet fear behind people's eyes. You sense the tension between who they are and who they pretend to be. And with each new revelation, the world you once moved through effortlessly begins to feel foreign, almost artificial. Your consciousness expands while their expectations remain the same, creating a silent fracture that only you can feel. This early phase of awakening is not about enlightenment, it is about disruption. It shakes your sense of belonging, challenges your identity, and exposes the psychological cost of living awake in a world designed for sleep. It is the first warning that truth has a price, and that clarity demands courage long before it brings peace. You begin realizing that your presence alone can make others uncomfortable, not because you speak, but because you see. That is the real danger of breaking the illusion. The moment your awareness rises, you stop fitting into the story everyone else needs to protect. And as you let this sink in, tell me, have you ever felt this shift happening inside you? If this resonates, share your experience in the comments and let me know how this kind of awareness shows up in your life. And while you are here, make sure to like the video and check whether you are already subscribed, because understanding this first step will make everything that comes next even more revealing. As your awareness sharpens and the illusion begins to crumble, you start to recognize the silent pact that holds society together. It is not written anywhere, yet everyone follows it instinctively. This invisible agreement is built on predictable behavior, emotional containment, and a mutual decision to avoid the deeper layers of truth. People perform their roles with remarkable consistency, relying on routine perception to keep their relationships and identities intact. But once you begin to see beyond the surface, this pact becomes strikingly obvious, almost impossible to ignore, and its fragility becomes a daily confrontation. You notice how most conversations are carefully structured to avoid discomfort, how people filter their words to maintain a sense of harmony that is more artificial than genuine. The collective illusion functions like a psychological buffer, protecting individuals from confronting their inner contradictions, unresolved fears, and hidden motives. The group depends on this shared blindness because true self-awareness would require dismantling everything they rely on for stability. And in this environment, your elevated perception becomes a quiet disruption, not through rebellion, but simply through noticing what others refuse to acknowledge. It becomes clear that the social world is built on mutual reinforcement of selective truths. People reward each other for staying inside the narrative and react with subtle resistance when someone steps outside of it. This is why the awakened mind feels increasingly out of sync. The rules that once made sense begin to feel limiting, even suffocating. Your consciousness no longer fits inside the small container that keeps everyone comfortable, and this mismatch slowly exposes the psychological mechanisms that maintain the illusion. You begin to see the emotional dependence people have on their roles, how identity becomes a shield, and how perception is shaped less by truth and more by the need for familiarity. The more you observe these patterns, the more you understand that the collective illusion is not sustained by deception, but by fear, fear of change, fear of awareness, fear of seeing oneself without filters. And in recognizing this, you step even further away from the pact, moving toward a level of clarity that the group instinctively avoids, even as the implications of that avoidance become increasingly clear in your own expanding perception. As your perception continues to expand, There comes a precise moment when the illusion no longer feels like a harmless social habit, but a thick veil separating you from the reality most people refuse to face. This moment is subtle at first, almost like a shift in atmospheric pressure. You begin to sense that what others call normal is actually a carefully curated performance, and every interaction becomes a mirror reflecting how deeply asleep the collective mind truly is. It is not that people are pretending consciously. It is that they have built their identities around narratives that cannot withstand honest self-examination. And when your awareness rises, the contrast between perception and pretense becomes impossible to ignore. You catch yourself pausing in conversations because the scripted nature of people's responses becomes painfully clear. You notice the automatic defense mechanisms, the emotional buffering, the way individuals cling to familiar explanations rather than question their internal contradictions. This heightened perception creates a kind of internal tension, a friction between the world you now inhabit and the one everyone else still believes in. You are no longer fooled by appearances, and this shift removes the psychological comfort that comes from belonging to the same perceptual reality as the group. There is a moment when the awakening becomes irreversible. It is the moment you realize that you cannot unknow what you now see. You cannot shrink your consciousness back to fit the expectations that once shaped your behavior. Something inside you has stepped outside the frame, and from that vantage point, the mechanics of human interaction become transparent. You see how people protect their illusions with rehearsed certainty. You see how they avoid silence because silence reveals too much. You see how they attach themselves to beliefs, not because those beliefs are true, but because they provide a sense of identity that would collapse without them. This is the threshold where the emotional cost of awakening becomes evident. You feel the weight of clarity, the dissonance of being awake in a room where everyone else is still dreaming, and the strange responsibility that comes with knowing you can never fully enter that dream again. And as this realization deepens, the next stage of the journey begins to emerge, shaping the inner landscape you must now navigate with increasing awareness. The deeper you move into awareness, the more you feel the subtle isolation that comes with seeing through the collective illusion. It is not the ordinary loneliness of lacking company. It is a profound solitude born of understanding realities that others cannot or will not perceive. Every social interaction becomes a test of endurance. You notice the hesitation in their eyes when your words or presence brush against truths they are unwilling to face. Even well-meaning friends and family unconsciously avoid the depth you now inhabit, seeking to maintain the comfort of their own unexamined lives. The psychological tension arises not from hostility, but from the simple fact that your perception has outgrown the narrative everyone else relies on. This stage of awakening is marked by a quiet but persistent friction between your inner clarity and the unconscious defenses of those around you. You begin to understand the subtle ways people project their fears, insecurities, and unacknowledged pain onto external circumstances, interpreting reality through the lens of convenience rather than truth. And as your perception sharpens, these patterns become more evident, leaving you in a space where the veil of social harmony feels almost suffocating. Every gathering, every casual conversation now carries an undercurrent of tension you cannot ignore because you perceive what remains hidden beneath the surface. At the same time, this awareness teaches you about boundaries in the most essential way. You realize that not every truth is yours to correct, and not every mind is ready to awaken. The energy required to navigate these interactions without losing your center is immense, yet it is also the crucible through which your own conscious strength is forged. You start to see the necessity of choosing carefully where you invest your attention, and when it is wiser to simply observe rather than intervene. And now, I invite you to reflect and share. Have you felt the tension between your awareness and the comfort of those around you? How do you navigate the spaces where others cannot see what you see? Leave your experiences in the comments below. Your insights might help someone else recognize the first signs of awakening. This is the stage where understanding your own capacity to hold awareness begins to shape the path forward, and the journey continues to unfold in ways that demand both courage and patience. As you navigate this heightened awareness, the isolation begins to manifest in subtler ways. It is no longer just the occasional awkward glance or the hesitation of others. It becomes an internal reckoning with the cost of clarity. You realize that as your perception sharpens, you are increasingly unable to engage in the collective pretense that society depends on. Social gatherings, casual exchanges, even familiar routines start to feel discordant. The invisible agreements that once smoothed the edges of interaction now feel like walls confining you to a space that no longer resonates with your consciousness. You are awake in a world that is still asleep, and this realization can be as disorienting as it is illuminating. This stage demands a new kind of endurance. Every observation, every insight carries weight, because the truths you perceive are rarely shared or acknowledged by those around you. You notice the patterns of behavior that keep people trapped in comfort and repetition, the avoidance of uncomfortable emotions, the reliance on habitual thinking, and the unconscious perpetuation of fear and limitation. Your mind begins to map the architecture of these dynamics, not to judge or condemn, but to understand the mechanisms that maintain the collective illusion. And with each layer you uncover, the space between your awareness and the world around you grows more apparent. The challenge lies in balancing the insight with equanimity. You understand that speaking out or attempting to correct the course of others is rarely effective and often met with resistance. Instead, your awakening becomes an exercise in presence, observing without interference, understanding without attachment, perceiving without imposing. It is a discipline of inner alignment, where clarity must coexist with patience and awareness with restraint. You come to see that the most profound influence is not through persuasion, but through consistent embodiment of consciousness, a living demonstration of what it means to perceive deeply while navigating the unconscious currents of human behavior. And in this unfolding, you also begin to recognize the paradoxical nature of awakening. The very clarity that isolates you also gifts you with the capacity for profound empathy, for seeing the humanity in every pretense, and for holding space for truth without forcing it. The awakening mind learns to move fluidly between observation and engagement, between detachment and compassion, and in doing so discovers a freedom that is invisible to those still enmeshed in the collective narrative. With this deepening awareness, you begin to witness the true cost of perceiving reality beyond the veil. You see how the structures people rely on, routines, roles, and unspoken agreements, are not merely convenient, but essential to their psychological survival. When you break through these structures in your own consciousness, you notice how fragile they really are for others. The world that once appeared stable now feels like a carefully balanced illusion, and your presence becomes a subtle disruptor. People may not openly challenge you, yet you sense the tension, the silent ripple caused by your elevated perception. They may continue their performances, but you are acutely aware of the cracks in the collective facade. This stage of awakening emphasizes the paradox of truth. The clearer your vision, the more apparent the fragility of what others depend on for comfort. Every interaction requires careful calibration. You must navigate the spaces between honesty and discretion, between observation and participation. You notice that even well-intentioned interventions can provoke defensiveness or confusion, because the collective is invested in maintaining a version of reality that feels safe. Your challenge is to witness without imposing, to understand without judgment, and to maintain your equilibrium even when the world around you operates on denial and habitual conformity. As your consciousness expands, you also perceive how truth has consequences beyond intellectual recognition. Emotional dynamics shift, relationships subtly realign, and routines that were once effortless now require conscious negotiation. This awareness brings both clarity and a kind of somber responsibility. You recognize the weight of seeing what others cannot, the quiet burden of inhabiting a space where illusions are transparent, and the subtle pressure of interacting with those who unconsciously resist the light of your perception. Every choice becomes significant, not because of direct action, but because of the ripple effects your awareness creates in the fabric of social reality. In this evolving journey, you begin to understand the delicate balance between engagement and withdrawal, You learn that the role of the awakened mind is not to forcibly awaken others, but to embody clarity in a way that allows consciousness to expand organically. Presence becomes the medium through which influence occurs, subtle yet profound, as your awareness interacts with the world without being absorbed by it. And as this understanding settles, you prepare to confront the next stage of awakening, the tension that arises when truth begins to challenge identities, routines, and the very foundations of the narratives people cling to. As your clarity deepens, you begin to notice the subtle hostility that arises when your perception pierces the veil that keeps others comfortable. It is rarely overt. Rather, it manifests in micro-reactions, hesitations, fleeting glances, subtle withdrawals. People unconsciously recognize the threat of awareness, the discomfort of being seen too clearly. Your presence, simply by embodying truth, can provoke defensive behaviors, not because you intend harm, but because the collective psyche is structured to maintain its own equilibrium. You become a mirror reflecting their avoidance, and mirrors are rarely welcomed without resistance. This tension becomes especially pronounced in relationships where long-held patterns of perception and denial have shaped interactions. Friends, colleagues, and even family members may respond with subtle criticism, sarcasm, or dismissal. They do not necessarily recognize the source of their unease. They feel it instinctively. The challenge is that your elevated consciousness highlights not only the superficialities, but also the deep-seated contradictions they prefer to ignore. The awakened mind experiences these dynamics with heightened sensitivity, understanding that the hostility is not personal, but a natural response to the disruption your awareness introduces. Navigating this environment requires the cultivation of patience and discernment. You must learn to hold your clarity lightly, to engage without needing to correct, to perceive without insisting. Awareness becomes a practice of boundaries, psychological, emotional, and energetic. The more you embody truth without interference, the more others unconsciously test the limits of their own comfort zones. And in observing these tests, you begin to see not just resistance but opportunity, the potential for subtle shifts in consciousness that occur without coercion, simply by your consistent presence and integrity. So I invite you to reflect and share in the comments. Have you noticed the silent resistance or tension that arises when you see more clearly than those around you? How do you navigate the discomfort that your awareness can provoke? Leave your insights below, because your experience can illuminate the path for others who are learning to balance presence with perception. This stage marks the ongoing challenge of remaining awake in a world designed to avoid the very truths you now perceive. As your journey continues, you confront the subtle but persistent conflict within yourself, the choice between speaking your truth and maintaining silence. Every insight you gain exposes the hidden currents of the world around you, revealing distortions, fears, and unconscious patterns that most people prefer not to acknowledge. Yet expressing these perceptions carries risk. Words have weight, and when directed at others who are not prepared to perceive, even the most compassionate observations can be misinterpreted, resisted, or rejected. This internal struggle becomes a central theme of awakening, as you weigh the value of disclosure against the cost it might exact. The awakening mind gradually realizes that the true power lies not in forcing recognition, but in embodying clarity. You understand that interventions rarely change others unless they are ready, and premature attempts to reveal truths often reinforce resistance. This stage emphasizes the importance of discretion, timing, and subtlety. You learn to navigate conversations with care, choosing what to share and when to remain quiet, understanding that your influence is most effective through presence rather than persuasion. The discernment required here is both psychological and spiritual, demanding deep trust in your own perception and in the natural unfolding of others' awareness. As you integrate this insight, you also perceive the nuanced layers of human attachment to illusion. You see how identities are constructed around selective realities, how people defend narratives that maintain comfort, and how the collective mind actively resists disruption. Your awareness becomes a lens through which you observe these dynamics without being consumed by them. This practice cultivates resilience, patience, and a deeper understanding of the limits of influence. It teaches you that sometimes the greatest impact is achieved through observation, reflection, and the silent integrity of your own consciousness. Within this evolving awareness, the tension between engagement and detachment sharpens, revealing a profound paradox. The more you know, the less you are compelled to intervene, yet the more your presence subtly reshapes the environment. You become a quiet force, a living example of consciousness, navigating a world entrenched in unconscious patterns. And in recognizing this delicate balance, you prepare to encounter the next stage, where the consequences of perception extend beyond observation, affecting not just your inner landscape, but the very structure of the reality around you. As your consciousness continues to evolve, you begin to perceive the full consequences of living outside the collective narrative. The clarity that once felt liberating now carries with it a weight of subtle responsibility. As you navigate a reality where social cohesion relies on shared ignorance, every interaction, every observation reminds you of the delicate equilibrium maintained by avoidance, the invisible agreements that allow most people to function without confronting uncomfortable truths. You see how behaviors, routines, and even relationships are structured to perpetuate illusions, and this recognition both isolates and empowers you simultaneously. The awakened mind becomes increasingly aware of the invisible boundaries that separate your experience from that of others. You notice the friction that arises not only in groups, but also in intimate relationships, where expectations and assumptions are built on incomplete understanding. The emotional resonance of being awake in a world designed for sleep is profound. You begin to experience the dissonance between your own perception and the reality others inhabit, which requires constant calibration of energy, attention, and interaction. The subtle exhaustion of holding this awareness becomes a daily rhythm, demanding both vigilance and self-care. At this stage, the boundaries between observation and action blur. You see patterns, foresee consequences, and understand dynamics that remain invisible to the uninitiated. Yet you recognize the limits of your influence. Attempting to correct, instruct, or awaken others prematurely often backfires, reinforcing their defenses or creating unintended disruption. This paradox underscores a central principle: consciousness cannot be imposed. It must be cultivated, nurtured, and allowed to emerge at its own pace. Your role is not to compel awareness, but to maintain your own clarity and integrity in the presence of collective unconsciousness. The ongoing challenge is to remain anchored while witnessing the pervasive unconsciousness around you. You begin to understand that the highest form of influence is subtle, indirect, and embodied. By holding your own consciousness steady, by acting from insight without interference, you create a ripple effect that allows others to perceive without coercion. This stage illuminates the profound art of awake living, to see, understand, and navigate the unseen currents without being swept away, and to embody clarity in a world that largely prefers to remain in the shadows. Finally, as your journey of awakening reaches this stage, you begin to understand how to live fully aware in a world that largely sleeps. The clarity you have cultivated allows you to navigate social structures, emotional dynamics, and personal interactions without being consumed by the illusions that dominate collective perception. You recognize that your role is not to force awareness onto others, but to embody it authentically, serving as a quiet presence that models conscious living. This awareness becomes both a shield and a compass, guiding your choices while preserving your center amidst the currents of unconsciousness surrounding you. You realize that the awakened life requires balancing engagement with detachment, empathy with discernment, and insight with restraint. Every action, every word, and every choice carries subtle influence, shaping reality not through coercion, but through the consistency of consciousness. You have learned to observe without interference, to perceive without judgment, and to act without attachment to outcomes. In doing so, you create a space where others can awaken at their own pace, without pressure, without conflict, and without the need for validation. This stage of conscious living is not about mastery over others, but mastery of presence, integrity, and self-alignment. As you reflect on this journey, remember that reaching the end of this path does not signify completion. Consciousness is an ongoing practice, a living experiment in perception, awareness, and alignment. And the most profound step you can take now is to continue embodying your clarity while gently inviting engagement, modeling truth without demanding recognition, and holding space for growth without interference. Your presence becomes a beacon, not a command, a demonstration of conscious living that inspires rather than dictates, awakens rather than coerces. If you have followed this journey and resonated with the experience, I encourage you to take a moment and leave a comment below with the phrase, "I am awake with clarity," showing that you made it to the end and are embracing your own perception. While you are here, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you can continue exploring these insights. And don't stop now. There's a video right here that complements everything you've just discovered, so click over and continue your journey into the depths of awareness and conscious living.